What the f is a twink? Honestly, the definition varies, so let me just pick one that captures the issue I see raised by the Souls community. Twinks are low-level characters engaging in PvP using overpowered gear for characters of their level. There is a loud opposition to this style of play, but there is also loud support, with accusations of unfairness on both sides. By the time you see this video, 1 million Twinks will have marched on Limgrave, and 2 million overleveled summons will have downscaled to meet them. President Miyazaki has declared martial law and tasked me, Special Agent Emotional John Jack Bauer, to restore order. The following takes place between 10 a.m. and 11 a.m. When we talk about twinking in any of these games, we should keep in mind that there have been a lot of changes over the years. My first experience with twinking was against a Dark Souls 1 Pyromancer. Back in those days, you were not matched by weapon upgrade level, and Pyromancy had no stat requirements. Basically, if you had a fully upgraded Pyromancy Flame and were low level, you could one-shot just about anyone in the early game. You might think, that's really funny, and I can see how that would suck. And you'd be right. It was exactly that. Great for the offender, terrible for the offended. But there is something else to remember about how that game's invasions worked. When you invaded, you could invade any level above you. Let me repeat myself to be as clear as possible. You could invade any level above you. If you were a level 1 Pyromancer, and you were, you could invade anyone level 1 to 713. So you can see that as an invader, you might want to pack some serious heat if you expected to win. You had no way of targeting or even knowing the level of your opponent, so coming unprepared could easily result in a loss. That system was very much in line with the themes of Dark Souls. Prepare to Die was about all the information you got from the back of the box, and you did well to heed that advice. It was even the name of the PC port. So when an invader showed up, a concept you were probably entirely unfamiliar with on its own, and they melted you in flame, you weren't exactly surprised. Twinks, and invaders of any level, encouraged players to consider the pros and cons of restoring their humanity. On the one hand, they gained the ability to summon allied phantoms, but they also opened themselves to invasion and often certain death. You had to balance the dread of loneliness against the caustic alchemy of camaraderie and conflict. That essence of balancing your playstyle is core to this conversation and the series as a whole. You would do well to remember that. In Dark Souls 2, they changed the matchmaking system to function using soul memory instead of character level. Now, creating a build with the intent of matchmaking at a specific level was all but impossible, as every soul gained pushed you higher and higher in the matchmaking brackets. This may have been an attempt to fix flaws in the previous system, but long story short, it made it a lot harder to reliably do anything, for better or worse. I like soul memory in concept and in certain aspects of its execution, but as someone who really enjoys making builds at different levels, it made the whole process a little futile. Dark Souls 2 also made it so you were constantly eligible for invasions, human or otherwise. You had to actively use up items to prevent invasions, which was great for activity, less great for players looking to avoid being taken to task too early or too often. Though soul memory made it a lot more difficult to invade at low level, which had the possibly unintended effect of lowering invasion activity at those levels. In Bloodborne, they returned to the system of character level based matchmaking, but adjusted the formula to somewhere around 10 levels plus 10% below and 20 levels plus 20% above the invader's level. This gave a fairly wide range for connectivity without leaving the door open for hundreds of levels between you and your opponent. The game also limited invasions to the presence of a Chime Maiden who appeared during cooperation, when deliberately summoned, or when in two specific areas. Bloodborne also added a protection feature for lower level players, disabling automatic Chime Maiden spawns for any character under level 30, effectively disabling invasions. This, coupled with a delay in access to leveling, and most new players were at least a few hours into the game before they could experience invasions. That buffer made it a lot safer for new players regarding invasions, but diminished the potential for activity. It was essentially a workaround rather than an actual fix. Dark Souls 3 took these ideas further with a few specific tweaks. First, it tightened the invasion range to between 90% and 110% plus 20 of the invader's level. Second, the game disabled invasions for new players until they interacted with multiplayer deliberately or entered an invasion zone. This made it so new players wouldn't instantly be invaded, but gave them the choice of how they wanted to interact with the first few levels, either alone or with multiplayer. But the biggest change Dark Souls 3 brought was weapon level matchmaking. Now, instead of being able to get the strongest version of equipment, you had to remain in close proximity to whatever level characters you expected to invade. For a new character, whose max upgrade would be +0, an invading character could only have a maximum weapon upgrade of +1. If all things were otherwise equal, their weapon damage had little to no advantage. These changes, while potentially damaging for activity, effectively curbed twinking at its most problematic. Instead of a kid who found their dad's gun, twinks became babies with a toy screwdriver. They had to be a lot more creative to leverage their advantages, with a much thinner margin for being overpowered. Low-level players, instead of being denied invasions if they wanted the opportunity, had their choice for how they wanted to play, both as hosts and as invaders. There were, of course, still problem builds. Hyper Twinks were now relegated to using the most efficient weapons at low brackets, such as the Dragon Slayer's Axe or Darkhand, or status conditions such as Poison or Toxic. They still had the benefit of much more potent healing and a much greater selection of equipment, but that advantage was not exclusive to invaders. A good note here relevant to the whole of any conversation around twinking. Invaders get a bad reputation as twinks, but hosts can and do twink just as much. Everything I have said regarding build potential or exploits applies just as much to any host as it does to an invader, with the only real difference being that the invader tends to be the initiator in a single-party consent context, assuming luring invaders is a two-party consent. And not only are twink builds as available to hosts as they are to invaders, but hosts have a second, unique advantage: overleveled summons. Password matchmaking carried over from Bloodborne in a very polarizing way. In Dark Souls 3, a character of any level could be summoned by any other by way of a password. This was great for playing with friends, but posed a problem regarding game balance. To compensate for the power disparity, the game applied a simplistic formula to lower their health and damage. In the most extreme cases, overleveled phantoms had about as much health as a new character, the damage of a mid-level character, and all the utility of a high-level character. If you've never fought an overleveled phantom as a low-level invader, the experience is pretty mixed. If you are a twink, it's very, very annoying. They have a lot more healing than you, are part of a team, and can use equipment and abilities you do not have access to. Essentially, they're twinking against you, except they didn't have to play through the game at a low level to gain that power. But if you're a twink, it can actually be pretty fun. They still have several advantages, but their reduced health makes them more susceptible to sudden damage. This dynamic moved pretty much unchanged into Elden Ring. Level ranges, weapon level upgrades, and overleveled summons all work more or less the same, but a major change was made: the removal of solo host invasions. This is essentially what was done in Bloodborne, but taken to an extreme. In Elden Ring, there is no way to be invaded while alone without deliberate use of the Taunter's Tongue. For invasions, this fundamentally changes the way you interact with hosts. You will always fight someone who has manually opted into the system, whether or not they're prepared. You will always fight someone who has at least one ally, possibly two, and no matter what level you invade at, you have no control over the equipment of the host or their summons. Even if the summons aren't overleveled, any group has an inherent advantage over an individual, and twinks are just builds that come prepared for those odds to the best of their ability. So what can we make of all this information? How should we feel about twinks? Are twinks a problem? When we talk about twinks as invaders, we're talking about low-level, high-gear builds that are prepared for as much as possible. In their most advantageous scenario, they're invading players who have just started new characters with a friend and have no equal means to defend themselves, as they lack the requisite skill or equipment to competently compete. In their least advantageous scenario, they're invading a twinked-out host and their overleveled summons who have been waiting for them. On the spectrum of invasions, that's a pretty wide range. If you ask me, that's sort of the best range. When you invade at higher levels, your likelihood of getting a natural invasion becomes much slimmer, as many players have finished the game. At mid-levels, you're very likely to get people playing through, but it can be difficult to determine the area you'll be invading or what combination of level and weapon to target. But at low level, you have a much more consistent experience. Every single character starts the game and they all go through Limgrave. There are so few exceptions that you'll be hard-pressed to find a more reliable invasion target. And from the other side, as someone who has been invaded by many twinks in my time, I was left with a distinct impression with every twink invasion. When that pyromancer melted me, when I got hit with Darkbead, when I was parried into oblivion, all I could think was, I want to do that. Not because I wanted to make anyone miserable, they hadn't made me miserable, but because I wanted to be powerful. I had power demonstrated to me in an unforgettable way, and it showed me these games were not just dreary, slow sword swingers, but also skillful, intense opportunities of extreme efficiency. And if you take away nothing else from this video, let it be this. A demonstration of power is an infectious thing. So now that we've covered the mechanics and appeals of twinking and how they've been rebalanced over the years, you might be asking, is there any reason people shouldn't do it? It sounds like twinks are powerful, competent builds who get a lot of invasions and don't have to play to high-level standards. It sounds like From Software started with a bad system and turned it into something more reasonable. What's the problem? Well, people hate it. People hate being invaded by a character definitively stronger than their own, and twinks are probably the most representative niche of that dynamic. They have all their talisman slots, fully upgraded heals, the best equipment for their level, and a focused build. When put up against 2 or 3 starting class characters of any skill level, the odds still generally sit with the twink. It's very difficult to overcome a character who can dish out respectable damage, heal to full on a single flask, and is likely well practiced to have gotten their equipment. In these scenarios, twinking can become punching down at its most disparate. And I think it's very understandable for players to resent twink invaders. They're just trying to play the game with their friends at their own pace, and a twink shows up with endgame gear to stomp them into the ground with ease. I've seen anecdotal reports of it outright turning people off the games. For me, that's a little tragic, but far from unacceptable. For me, it would be a lot more tragic if the game catered to the wants and whims of new players. New players, by every definition, don't know the game well enough to make a judgment about the experience. They can absolutely have judgments about their experience, but they can't speak to a broadly applicable system with any certainty. A player who has never invaded, let alone made a twink, should not be tasked with deciding what is fair or balanced for such gameplay. If Dark Souls let me have my way when I first started playing, I would have remapped the attacks to the face buttons, set the difficulty to very easy, and cheated at the first inconvenience. I would have just made it Skyrim. Because before these games, I didn't care much for being challenged. I just wanted to roleplay in a power fantasy unimpeded. But Dark Souls, and all of these games, forced me to change my perspective, and for that I am forever grateful. These games made me better at playing and appreciating games. The struggle I overcame fundamentally improved how I view the world. It gave me perspective. Had they not forced me to play their way, I would have played my way. A worse way. This is something I consider essential to this sort of game design. Souls games are not sandboxes. They are not looter shooters. They are not casual co-op games. They are hardline, dark, and high fantasy action RPGs with a focus on challenge and adversity. If they didn't impose those values, they wouldn't be a good version of the games they're trying to be. And that, to me, speaks volumes about how I want people to view twinks. You can hate them. You should hate them, just as you hate any invader, just as you hate any boss, just as you hate being defeated, being disgraced. But you should appreciate the experience the game is giving you, for better and worse. Games without friction have their place, as do games with friction. These games, Souls games, are games that embrace friction, and twinks are high friction. They're a way for players to get the absolute most out of every level, and that is worth appreciating. There's nothing dishonest or problematic about making the best character you can in a game about building characters, and there's nothing game-breaking about invading people who are eligible for invasions, demanding a certain quality or caliber beyond what the game facilitates, claiming helplessness or unaccountability. These are all surefire ways to make sure you are as in conflict with the game as possible. You're cheating yourself out of an experience you could be embracing. I want to take the rest of this video to focus on low-level builds and low-level invasions from my own perspective. I'm not the biggest fan of high-damage, sudden death matches where getting hit 2, maybe 3 times is all even the tankiest character can manage. At low level, with adequate health, most builds can take 4 or 5 major hits, That's a lot more appealing to me as someone who likes drawn out fights. That's why when I twink, I am doing so to cater to that experience. I want to play essentially as a minimum viable build, where I have only the bare essential stats and whatever gear I can manage. I have my own code of ethics and preferences for what I find tasteful, and I have my own definitions of honor and fairness. I'd personally be fine with fewer heals and less utility, but no matter how I feel, the same glaring issue has persisted through each entry in the series. I do not control who I invade. Even if I target the lowest levels, even if I target the starting area, even if I have remote access to every new player's computer and can track their every move, I cannot pick my target. I have to invade prepared to deal with whatever is on the other side. If it's a fresh host and his starting build friend, I'll probably either kill them quickly to get a new match or just try to give them as much of a chance as I can manage. I might even leave, but that's not why I invade. I am no stranger to pity or mercy, but I don't invade to do people favors. I invade to fight. I invade to kill. So I'll fight and I'll kill whomever I find. Broadly speaking, twinking is a way for me to have a more casual invasion with a change of pace and scenery. But whether or not you might find that palatable, whether or not you think I'm just making excuses to justify my own sadism, I want to acknowledge that nothing I'm saying changes the very real reality that some twinks are trying to grief. Some twinks are just trying to humiliate and decimate their opponents. But that problem is not exclusive to twinks, it's just more effective. Griefing exists at every bracket and on every side, so complaining specifically about twinks, to me, feels like a defense mechanism. It is easy to excuse a defeat by saying there was nothing you could have done about it, by putting all the blame on the opponent and essentially accusing them of cheating. But when we blame a specific build niche or playstyle, we attack something these games offer us that enriches the experience. There are very, very few games that allow you to avoid leveling. There are even fewer games that allow you to do so while participating in multiplayer, and there are fewer still that let you make your build with weapons of your choice in your own time with no strings attached. As much as getting killed by a twink can sour the experience, it has even more potential to sweeten it, for all parties involved. A powerful twink invader can give you a hell of a fight. I have had some of my best experiences fighting with my not-so-efficient allies against builds we could never take alone. Thankfully, the game made sure we wouldn't have to. We fought as a team against these toddler powermongers, and when we were victorious, it was true elation. But I don't want to tell you that fighting a twink will always, or even usually, be a positive experience. Like any invasion, it will often be grueling and miserable. When you just want to summon your friend to run through Limgrave and you get shut down at every turn by the bad red man and his seemingly limitless arsenal of bullshit, you are allowed to hate what he's done and hate the game for allowing him to do it. But I would encourage you to embrace that frustration and channel it into turning the tables. Appreciate the nuances of his build and how he's managed to use a variety of gear at such a low level. Maybe take notes and think about how you might want to take some of that power for yourself. Use the surge of fear and adrenaline to sharpen your decision-making skills. And learn from your failures, especially those that are least fair. Now you might be sitting there, typing in the comments telling me to unalive myself because I'm encouraging this sort of malice and unwarranted punishment. You might be telling me off for suggesting that twinks have any place in a game when obviously they only exist to ruin everyone else's experience. You might think I'm the worst among them for suggesting it's okay to be made to hate something you paid for. And honestly, that's all fine. I don't want anyone to hate playing the game, and I won't sit here and pretend that getting curb stomped your first 20 minutes into a session can't have that effect. But so much of the charm and appeal of these games comes from that relentless, pull-no-punches design that made the first enemy the grafted scion, that put the tree sentinel right outside the first step, that lets players get invaded the second they get a date. When Elden Ring, or any of these games, kills you via an overpowered early boss or souped up twink invader, you're getting what you paid for. They aren't teaching you how to win, but rather how to lose. They're teaching you to learn from your mistakes, especially the ones you don't realize you're making. They are giving you the tools to take anything the game can throw at you in stride, and that is a lesson worth learning. So the next time you're invaded by a twink who uses the coil shield and the ant spur rapier, don't submit. Get your buddies, put your heads together, and kick his fucking ass. This is far from all I want to say on twinks, or griefing, or ganking, or any of that. This channel is very new, and I'm just trying to find my rhythm, so if you like the video, please consider doing the thing, like and subscribe, and all that to let me know I'm hitting my mark. If you have any content requests, complaints about my candor, or just want to schedule a fist fight, please leave a comment down below. Thank you for watching.